Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Kidd. I'm a partner in the employment team at Mills and Reeve, and this is my colleague Richard.
Hello. So I'll kick us off. Hopefully everyone can see us and hear us okay. Welcome to our HR Hub, the first one we've done via webinar. And you'll see from the title, Looking Beyond the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. We've said looking beyond. What we're going to cover today is I'm going to spend some time just looking very briefly at what has happened so far. Flip me on, James, the agenda, thanks. So I'll spend some time just looking at what's happened so far, just so we can set the scene, albeit I imagine many of you have been involved or following the government guidance for quite a while now. James will then spend some time looking at some of the areas of uncertainty because as you'll all know, if you've been involved in furloughing staff or any restructure so far, or you've been following the government guidance, there has been some uncertainty because there is no actual legislation. Whilst we had the coronavirus bill, we haven't had any specific legislation dealing with the details. So we have had the government guidance and we've had to interpret that both as businesses and as employment lawyers. So there has been plenty of areas of uncertainty. So James will cover off some of the key areas that we've had, and then we'll look at what happens next. We'll focus on what we're going to do for the future and what's going to happen when these restrictions are relaxed or we all come out the other side of this lockdown. So we'll spend some time just looking at what options there are coming out of this. In terms of housekeeping, flip the slide on, James.
I'm on it, Rich.
Yeah. This webinar is being recorded, so be aware of that. It will be available on demand afterwards, so feel free to watch it again. You'll be able to log on and watch it again or share it amongst colleagues or contacts. You'll see the chat has been disabled. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And thank you for all the questions that you've all submitted to us in advance of this session. They've been really useful in helping us to tailor the content, and the content you'll see will reflect some of the questions that you've asked. But if you do have any questions as we're going along today, as I say, use the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will be monitoring that as best as we can. It may be that at the end we've got time to answer some of those questions for you today. Otherwise, what we will do is we'll collate all of those questions at the end, and we'll provide you all with a written document that will have all the answers to any of the questions that you've asked. So bear with us today, and as I say, if we have got time, we will deal with them. We're also going to launch a few polls throughout the session, so please participate. Let us know what your views are on the questions that we ask, and let us know what your organisations are doing about some of the things that we'll be discussing. That will be really useful for us, and I think actually useful for you all just to see what each other thinks. So whizzing on to what has happened so far. The coronavirus job retention scheme, as many of you will know, was announced on the 20th of March. The intention behind the scheme was that it would enable businesses to avoid redundancies by alleviating the pressure on employers to continue paying wages during this crisis period. It's currently open for at least 4 months. So at the moment, it's due. So it was originally set to close end of June, but the government has said that it is likely to be extended. There was a tip-off on the BBC today to say that it is likely that it will be extended and it will be phased. So it's unlikely to just come to a complete halt on the 30th of June, and that it is likely to be phased. And there have been some different suggestions about how that will be phased, but clearly the idea is that businesses will come back in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and in all sorts of different financial positions. And so the idea behind the scheme being phased is to hopefully be able to allow for different businesses to come back and reopen in, as I say, in various different guises. We had the Treasury direction, so hopefully some of you will have read the Treasury direction. This provides the mechanism for employers to reclaim the wage costs. You'll all know this, but the original guidance was that you are able to claim 80% of wage costs subject to the cap of £2,500 plus employers' NI and auto-enrolment pension costs. The Treasury direction came out on the 15th of April, and that set out the legal basis for the administration of the scheme. And we'll discuss some of the discrepancies that have come up between the Treasury guidance and the guidance that we've had from HMRC and the government, and the difficulties that has caused in the section where James talks about some of the uncertainty. So we'll cover that off. There have been several versions of the government guidance notes so far. They've been frequently updated, which have kept us as employment lawyers and HR very busy. I think there have been 8 versions of the main employer's guidance so far, so it's been continually changing, and we've been having to be keeping up to date with that. The online portal for claims opened on the 20th of April 2020, and the first payments have now been made. We've got some stats, and so as of the 3rd of May, when we last looked at this, there's no set pattern for these being updated, so they're just being released ad hoc. And the last that we heard on the 3rd of May was that 6.3 million jobs have so far been claimed for. 800,000 employers have made claims, and there's over £8 billion claimed so far. So incredible numbers that we've seen already. The payment of the first grant will be made within 6 days of an eligible claim being accepted, we're told. So if any businesses that are listening are struggling with cash flow, then it goes without saying to get your claim in as soon as possible. But the good news is that it seems like the payments appear to be made pretty quickly when they talk about the 6 days. So that's good news for employers. Right, if we just have we'll try our first poll and see if this works. Hopefully all of you can see that on my screen. So the first poll that we're asking is, what is your experience, for those of you that have used it, what's your experience of the HMRC online portal? So have you used it and is it easy to navigate? Have you used it and had difficulties, or haven't you used it yet? So I'll launch this poll now. And I'll give you the results in a minute. We'll give everybody a bit of time to answer.
Gosh, not many people have used it yet.
No, it's just the numbers are just creeping up a little bit. Still some people can just voting, so let's just give it a minute. Still going, people still thinking.
I think I'd call that.
Yeah, should we end that? So the results, you'll see, hopefully if I share these, I'll share these results with you all. You'll see 68% of you haven't yet used the online portal. Those that have, it seems it's working reasonably well. 30% of you have used it and find it easy to navigate. Only a few of you have used it and had difficulties. I know we've had some questions from a few clients about some of the technicalities around it, but it seems like, looking at that most of you have used it, find it easy to navigate, which is good. We don't know for sure, but it's been estimated that around 9 million workers across the UK will be furloughed. So there will be a significant amount of claims going through the scheme. As I say, so far, it seems to be working well. But there are certainly, we've had so many questions over the past few weeks about how the furlough scheme is intended to work and what circumstances it covers. And as I said at the start of this presentation, there have been some discrepancies between the Treasury guidance. The information that we've had from the government has been, some areas have been very unclear. So I'll hand you over to James just to talk about a few of the areas of uncertainty that we've seen so far. James.
Thanks, Rich. I've stopped sharing the poll, but if it's still showing, let's get rid of that. Okay.
No, it's come off my screen now, so hopefully.
It's working smoothly today. Okay, so I'm going to talk about consent, annual leave, sick pay, and shielding. So let's start with consent. When we started on this wonderful journey, which was the furlough scheme, all of us understanding what the hell furlough meant, some of us having to look it up, it was a real unknown as to whether actually you needed to go out to Fred and Ginger and say to them, would you consent to me putting you on furlough, or was it okay to just say, hey, you're now on furlough? Much depended upon whether the employer was topping up or not, because if you're not topping up, saying to somebody who's earning less than £37,500 a year, that's an immediate drop in their salary. And as we know, the furlough scheme is an overlay above normal employment law. So the normal employment law sits there. This isn't legislation, this is just guidance and the Treasury direction. So what does that all mean? Basically, if I ask you to consent to something and you say yes, happy days, employment law is very happy operating in the land of consent. If I ask you to do something and you say no, and I do it anyway, or I don't ask you, I just do it anyway, which would be putting you on furlough, we have potentially an issue. And what we went through is, do we need consent or not? To start with, it was unclear. And it was just the case of that to be eligible for the grant, the employers must have confirmed in writing to the employee, confirming that they've been furloughed. So regardless of whether I've sought or gained your consent, if I just say to you in writing you've been furloughed, happy days, as I say. We then get, as Richard points out, this Treasury direction, which comes out middle of April, which put the cat amongst the pigeons, to be fair. And basically, as you can see, it must be the employer and the employee must have agreed in writing that the employee will do no work during their period of furlough. Now, the reason why the cat was amongst the pigeons was a lot of people read this as meaning that actually you needed the employee's consent able to benefit from the grant under the scheme. Now, we didn't interpret it that way, and subsequently we've got satisfaction on that actually this is just about avoiding the fraud where some employers were having employees still work and also claim the grant under the benefit scheme. So you do need somehow or another to have gained an acceptance or a recognition from the employee that they won't do any work during the period of furlough. But what we've come down to is you have to have a record and keep the record that the person has been furloughed, but the employee doesn't have to provide a written response. So summing all that up, what I'm saying to you is, in an ideal world, we love traveling by consent in employment law terms, and it's always going to be easier to operate the furlough scheme with an employee's consent because you can achieve far more, and you don't not operating in a period of that employee might bring some claims later for unlawful deductions, say, if I've dropped their salary to 80%, whereas they were previously earning more than £37,500. So we like consent. Many of our clients, in particular some of Richard's, where they just needed to operate on a rapid basis, thousands of employees were just furloughed, so no consent was sought. So we're operating in different arenas here, and that gives rise to different employment issues. But if you have just furloughed and didn't seek consent, you should still be able to benefit from the grant, but you need to have addressed they won't be working and keep a written record. Okay, that was consent.
I think, James, sorry to chip in, but I think even though we've said the Treasury guidance has legal effect, whereas the government guidance doesn't, you'll have seen from the dates that this latest guidance we had from the government was issued obviously after the Treasury guidance, so they would have had the Treasury guidance in their minds when issuing this. So it would be crazy for them to, we suspect, for them not to honour the grants that are claimed for on the basis that with no consent, even though this is at odds with the Treasury guidance, clearly the Treasury guidance was in their minds when providing this last version. So,
good point. Thanks, Rich. Appreciate that. Okay, annual leave. This is a bit easier, but it does require you thinking about something which is whether it's mutually exclusive or not. And I might wave my hand around a bit for that. Okay, so at the outset, we had lots of speculation as to whether if I'm on furlough here, can I take holiday, and are they mutually exclusive, or can they operate at the same time? And many learned people, cleverer people than me, were saying, well, this is akin to somebody on long-term sick, who then is able to say, partway through the long period of sickness, if it lasts, say, a year, put their hand up and say, I'd like to take my statutory leave. The point being, long-term sick, where you run out of company sick pay, you run out of SSP, and statutory leave are mutually exclusive. You can't have them at the same time. So what happens is you stop effectively your sickness absence, you take your holiday, you get paid in full for your holiday, and then you return to your sickness absence. So people were using the same analysis for furlough and annual leave and saying, well, they will be two different things. Now, our view was, well, hang on a minute, this is a scheme designed to help employers deal with the effects of the pandemic. And if you've got a situation where somebody is on furlough, say for 3 weeks, and then for a week they take some holiday, at that point, the employer is having to pay 100% of pay for that employee to take that holiday, not offset or supported by the grant. That surely doesn't make sense, because it's going to be a financial strain on the employer at that point. So that was our view, and we subsequently had confirmation, although ACAS went through different variations on that. So the position is, yes, employees will accrue holiday and they can take holiday leave. If they do so, the employer has to top it up. So if they are getting the benefit of just the 80% or £2,500, whichever is lower under the grant, then when they take holiday, so like over the Easter weekend and on Friday this week, you top it up to 100%. What is unclear at the moment is whether the employer can say, okay, I want you to take a week's holiday next week. Now, as Richard said, the government has had ample opportunity to do many things, but have so far, despite repeated requests, refused to clarify some annoying points. This is one of those. Why can't it just be clear that employers can elect to say to employees, yes, we require you to take holiday? Two schools of thought on that, perhaps. The first is, well, the government's already said, we've given everybody longer, so up to 2 years to take your holiday. So why should employers be forcing employees to take holiday when they can't go anywhere and are just stuck at home, say? The other school of thought says, well, under the working time regs, an employer can always give double the amount of notice to require an employee to take a period of leave. So if you want them to take a week's notice, then you'd say, here's 2 weeks notice for you to take a week's notice. Our view is the employer can say to an employee, I want you to take your holiday, and may well be doing so because they want the employees to be there when the world returns to normal. I was on a CBI webinar the other day where the very learned chap from the CBI said, if and when we return to normal, my heart sank at the if, and let's just concentrate on the when. And obviously with Boris telling us on Sunday that everything's going to be tickety-boo, the when will hopefully be sooner rather than later. Okay, that's enough on annual leave. Can you put employees who are on sick leave on furlough? Oh, this is slightly complicated and slightly annoying, if that's the right term. So if Georgina is short-term sick, it's unclear, but our preference is if they are short-term sick, then they shouldn't be put on the furlough scheme, and you should be instead paying them SSP, or actually company sick pay if that is available. The tweak, perhaps, and you didn't hear it from me, is that they then become well again and then they can be furloughed. So that's a short-term sickness. For long-term sick, government guidance says, yeah, that's fine. You can put that person on furlough, and then if they are currently on SSP, then obviously they stop getting SSP at the point they're on furlough. I refer you back to my statements about mutually exclusive. Here, furlough and SSP are not happy bedfellows. It needs to be one or the other. So you can't be on furlough and getting the benefit of the grant and also claiming SSP, particularly for that 2-week period where the government is allowing you to recover the first 2 weeks of SSP. Lastly, what happens if the person becomes sick whilst they're furloughed? Then the practical position is, A, how will you know? Will the person actually tell you? I mean, it depends on your level of engagement with those employees. And B, do you want to know? Because in a sense, it's easier for the person just to remain on furlough, because otherwise you're then into sickness absence reporting and then thinking about whether you need to take them off the furlough scheme and put them on SSP. Furlough will always be higher than SSP. It seems to me that the only time the person will want to come off furlough is that they'll want to move to employer sick pay or company sick pay, where that is higher than furlough capped pay. So actually they might want to do that if they are clever and minded to do that. Okay, shielding. So do you remember we've both said, Richard and I both said, some discrepancies between the guidance and the Treasury direction? Another one. It's very unhelpful that government departments can't get themselves aligned. So originally the guidance said, yeah, if someone's shielding, you can put them on furlough and that's fine and they'll get the benefit of the grant. Now the direction, the practice Treasury direction says, actually, if they are shielding or looking after somebody that's shielding, they are on sickness absence and should get SSP. And it's unclear, therefore, which route you should go down. Should you go down the guidance route, which means you put them on furlough, or should you go down the Treasury direction route, which means they're on sickness absence and only get SSP? Our view is, it seems right that actually we go with the guidance here, even though arguably the direction trumps it. And we would say go with furloughing, but there's a bit of a risk there. And as you can see, safe to deduct SSP from the claim. So you're not claiming both SSP and furlough. It's one or the other. Okay, let's go with what happens next. Richard.
Have we got any polls, James, actually, whilst we're on that? Have we got any polls that we, just looking at what polls we had that might be useful for people to...
Shall we go? Did you get staff to agree in writing to being furloughed? Let's do a quick one of that. I know we've moved on since then, but...
We've had a question on that actually as well, which is probably quite, is a very common question. So I might just deal with that. I know we said we wouldn't answer questions as we go, but I think one of the questions that we've been asked has been a really common question that we've been asked over the last few weeks. So
I'm just going to...
You give the results of this poll.
Yeah,
and then
it's
I'll
amazing.
Question.
Really, really strong. 80% of people said got staff to agree in writing to being furloughed. So it's the majority of your clients, Richard, that were just doing it, I think.
Yeah, and interestingly, one of the questions that we've had it says presumably the consent to furlough is still needed if companies aren't topping up the furlough pay, and then in brackets in terms of employment law rather than ability to claim the grant. And I think one of the most common misconceptions around the scheme, and certainly at the start of all of this, one of the most common questions we were asked was around this, around consent from employment law purposes. And I think, as I say, one of the most common misconceptions was that the scheme allowed you to reduce an employee's pay to 80% because that was what the government was reimbursing. So when this 80% figure was bandied around and it was all in the news and Martin Lewis was talking about it, immediately everybody thought this was effectively an ability to allow employers to reduce employees' pay down to 80%. But the scheme is simply the CJRS scheme is simply a means of reimbursing employers an amount of money towards an employee's pay. And the guidance makes it very clear that normal employment law principles still apply. So I think in answer to that question, presumably where is consent still needed if companies aren't topping up, then then yes, clearly there is a potential claim of breach of contract from the employee if their pay is reduced to 80% without consent. Now, again, a number of employers have been taking a view, particularly if they are in real financial difficulties. And for example, some retailers that have had to shut their shops and therefore have no income coming in, have taken the view, well, actually, even though we might be faced with breach of contract claims, we'll face those later down the line and we'll settle them, as and when we need to, because at the moment we can only afford to pay the 80%. And so they've tried to get consent, and then if they haven't been able to achieve consent, then they've just pressed ahead and we'll deal with breach of contract claims later down the line. But yeah, the answer to that question is you're absolutely right. Consent is still needed if you are reducing the pay to 80%. In order to avoid facing any breach of contract claims.
Right, well, linked to that is, let's just do another quick one. Did anyone object to being furloughed? So I know of some people who did. Yeah, oh, massively more interesting. I'll share the results in a moment. The people who are likely to object are the higher earners. So I talked about that 37.5 grand. 37.5 grand is 100%, 80% being 30 grand, and 30 grand is the 2.5k cap if you work it out in that way. So the only a handful of people, less than a fifth of people, objected. Interesting. Okay. I think it depended upon hearts and minds. If your communications were good enough, people got it that there's no money coming in, for example, so they understood. All right. Let's crack on, Rich.
Yeah. So we're on to what happens next. Let me just get rid of the poll off my screen. So I guess it's a good time to pause now. People have generally got their strategy in place in terms of the staff they've needed to furlough. Appreciate some of you, this might be a moving feast, and you've had to rethink as we've gone along. But generally, most employers have now got all their ducks in a row in terms of how their business will function during this lockdown period. So it is a good time to then pause, regroup, and think about what might be next for your organisation, so you can plan that smooth transition back. What will be critical to that will be the government's decisions on whether the furlough scheme will be extended, phased out, or simply stopped on the 30th of June. I spoke briefly about that earlier. But we just need to keep a watching brief on all the government's announcements, and everyone needs to make sure. I'm sure most of you are signed up to all of our briefings and are keeping an eye on our coronavirus hub, because that will continue to update you all as and when anything changes, or even once we start to get wind of anything changing. But as I said earlier, there has been a suggestion from the BBC today that Rishi Sunak has said the subsidy is likely to be phased out rather than stopped immediately, in recognition that different industries will be returning at different times and in different forms and on different terms. So we need to think about, how quickly is your business going to return to normal? What will you do? Will it look differently? Will you need to reshape the business? Do you have the right people in place? And again, if the organisation looks different, do you then have the right people in place, or do you need to think about the number of employees that you have? Can you buy time, or do you need to act fast? And then might you need to permanently reduce headcount? So again, if the business looks different and you don't necessarily need all of the people that you had pre-lockdown, then do you need to think about permanently reducing headcount and going through a redundancy exercise? And we'll talk a little bit more later about consultation in that regard. So option one on the slide here, we've called business as usual. That would obviously be the ideal scenario for all, but realistically, I suspect it's going to be some time before it is really what we would call business as usual. And so we'll look at what you need to be considering for when the furlough period ends over the next slide or two. But option one we've described there as the furlough period ends, let's say for ease, now on the 30th of June, and employees simply return to work on their previous terms. So you can pick you have the ability to pick your business back up and run as it was previously. So everyone returns to work on previous terms. That's ideal scenario option one. The second option in terms of reducing costs, as I've said, there's been certainly some noise about the furlough scheme being extended. If you are going to extend furlough, given that you'll have issued the employees with notice and you'll have either got furlough agreements or you'll have sent letters out confirming the terms under which the employees are furloughed, if the government does extend the furlough scheme and you're intending to keep people off furloughed, then you will need again to think about writing to them and again trying to go through that period of consent, and particularly if you're going to reduce pay, as we've just discussed. If you are thinking about dropping their pay down to the 80%, then again you'll need to think about the letter that you write to them and the consent that you get. It may be that an option is returning to work on reduced hours of pay. So again, you would need consultation. You need to go through consultation and consent plus reasonable notice, and you'd need to think about what happens if you don't get consent. If employees won't agree to return on reduced hours or reduced pay, then do you need, from a financial perspective, to look at dismissal and re-engagement? And if this is presented to employees as an alternative to redundancy, then again, thinking about collective consultation obligations that might be triggered, and James will talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the same with reducing hours and pay. If you're changing employees' terms and conditions significantly, then again, you might need to think about whether you need to consult on that, and you certainly will if you're thinking about dismissing and re-engaging. Do you have the contractual right to lay off? Some employers, particularly very common in manufacturing, for example, will have the ability to lay off under the contracts, but that can come with its own complications. So if you lay off if employees are off for a 4-week period, then they can claim redundancy pay, which might have an impact on your ability to, or the structure of the organisation when things turn round, and also might have a financial impact on the organisation if you've got enhanced redundancy terms. So thinking about that. And then unpaid leave or sabbaticals might start to become a little bit more attractive, depending on what Boris says about relaxing restrictions and lockdown. And when certainly for the time being, whilst we're all required to stay in and only go out for the 4 permitted reasons, it's not particularly attractive for employees to reduce their hours voluntarily or take unpaid leave or sabbaticals because they're unable to go anywhere. But yeah, as and when we are able to travel again and employees might be able to go away or take holidays, then unpaid leave, sabbaticals might become a little bit more attractive once again. And then reducing headcount through redundancies. The reality is that the effects of COVID-19 and lockdown on the economy will mean that lots of employers will need to look at redundancies in the short and medium term. Lots of questions that we had sent in prior to the session were around redundancy and when we can consult and when can we start looking at the shape of our organisation. And again, to the extent we'll try to cover off as much of that as we can today, but we'll also reply to as many of the questions as we can around redundancy and around the process. As I say, we'll look at consultation shortly, but in terms of pools, you are able to look at furloughed and non-furloughed staff when you're considering who you're going to think about making redundant. You need to focus on what type of work is going to be ceasing or diminishing, and that might be different again for different organisations. So whilst it might seem obvious that furloughed staff are more likely to be the ones that aren't needed when we come out the other side of this, clearly again that's very different for different organisations. If you are again using a retail example, if you're a retailer and you've shut your shop, when you're allowed to reopen again, you may need all the staff back And so therefore, it's not a case that just because they've been furloughed, that's an indication that they're unlikely to be needed post lockdown. So you need to focus on what type of work is ceasing or diminishing, and who is doing that. Flip me on, James, if you can. So we're just looking quickly at how do we end furlough, and what notice do you need to give to employees, and what are the health and safety concerns, what about employee well-being, both during this time and when we return, and then I've put on there flexible working requests because we think they're going to be fairly common. So how do you end furlough? Well, there's no prescribed form, so there's nothing in the guidance or the Treasury direction that provides a mechanism for bringing furlough to an end. It doesn't mean that we might not get something as we get closer to the time, but certainly for the time being, we don't have anything. If you've covered off what will happen at the end of furlough in your furlough agreement or in your furlough letter, then clearly you need to follow the terms of that and follow the approach that you've told the employees you're going to take. But you will need to confirm what happens in writing. So you are going to need to write to the employees and tell them what their plans are. Now, in terms of notice, so when do you write to them and what notice do you give? Again, we've got nothing so far that says what is reasonable notice. Again, as we get closer to that 30th of June date, or if that's extended, we may get something from the government in terms of guidance. But at the moment, it's a bit finger in the air in terms of what is reasonable. We certainly wouldn't expect less than 48 hours to be reasonable. We might think a week would be enough. But I think again, it's giving some thought to individual circumstances, and you may decide to phase things in, but you'll need to give employees some notice, because clearly there will be some employees will have different commitments and arrangements at home. So some employees may have childcare commitments, they may have caring responsibilities, and therefore it is important that you're giving them as much notice as you can if you are going to bring them back, so they can make those arrangements at home if they are in those situations. So in terms of health and safety, you're going to need to consider the government advice at the time, and you're going to need to think about what social distancing measures are in place. We're likely to have social distancing measures in place for a while, and so you'll need to think about the impact that this has on how you run your business. What precautions are needed to protect staff? Well, other countries coming out of lockdown are imposing pretty strict rules now. I guess given how we've dealt with the lockdown situation compared to other countries such as Spain and Italy, we might not impose as strict rules as they have coming out the other side of this. But other countries are imposing strict rules. So I know, for example, Spain are issuing sanitizers to people on public transport. So it's measures like that, and just thinking about how we are going to best protect people. How does the business need to change? So will you be allowing people to travel less busy times, for example? So you might introduce flexible start and end times to the day. You might provide things like parking for employees. You might think about cycle racks. I know one employer was talking to us about to encourage people to cycle in a little bit more and reduce the burden on public transport, and also make it safer not to be travelling on public transport. And I know that a number of businesses will have invested significantly in IT during this period, because people will have been working from home. So the structures that you've put in place so far will hopefully put you in good stead for employees being able to work from home and work a bit more flexibly, but also then thinking about, can you do more when we come back from this in order to keep staff safe. We've had a leaked government document that James actually sent to me this morning that suggests there's going to be 7 different guidance papers for different sectors coming out in terms of giving hints and tips to businesses on how they might think about protecting and reassuring staff when we come back. So there's a general guidance for all workplaces, which is going to cover things like sanitizers on entry and exit for buildings, separate entry and exit points for buildings and offices, one-way routes around buildings, certainly things like warehouses. There was talk about one-way routes around factories, warehouses, non-face-to-face contact, and things like encouraging use of stairs instead of lifts to avoid people being in confined spaces. So there was a lot of there was the general guidance, but then there was also specific guidance for different sectors, because clearly different sectors are going to return in different ways and operate very differently. So there was different guidance for different sectors, including hotels and restaurants, workers who work in other people's homes, factories and warehouses, shops, office workers, and then the final one was people working in a vehicle. So there'll be different guidance for different, as I say, for different types of organisation and different sectors.
It's worth saying that those are just draft documents at the moment and are not confirmed. So they're available.
As I say, they are quite interesting actually. Yeah, it was just a BuzzFeed article. If you look at that and you go onto BuzzFeed, you'll see that it was quite interesting in terms of just thinking about things. As we say, they're not in any way binding, and they're draft documents, but they will give you some really good ideas of things that you should be thinking about, as we hopefully come out the other side of this. And then employee well-being. Many employees will have been out of your business for a significant amount of time, so it's just thinking about their mental well-being as they return. And if some employees are being kept on furlough while some are coming back, then it's just about keeping those lines of communication open and make sure you're speaking to your staff about what's going to happen. Just very quickly, flipping the slide on, James, we put a slide in here, lessons from B&Q. The reason we've called this slide Lessons from B&Q, I won't go into too much detail, but one of my partners recently attended a webinar organised by the CBI, and there was a fascinating presentation from B&Q Kingfisher on what they'd gone through as an organisation. And there were some key messages that came out of that in terms of how they dealt with the whole closure and furlough process. So closing completely at the start to take stock of what they were going to do, how they communicated to their staff, tips on how they'd use things like Yammer to communicate with staff while they were off, but then also thinking about how they returned once they were allowed to open again. So many of you will know there'll be many retailers on the call, but retailers that have been allowed to either remain open or open again are using things like perspex screens in all their stores. The B&Q had said they'd had the benefit of the testing in supermarkets first, so they could adopt some of the processes that supermarkets had adopted. So limiting customers, having lines, for example, on the floor so that they could distance customers between each other. But interestingly, one of the biggest things, and it will go hand in hand really from some of the guidance that we get from the documents like the one we've just talked about, is around how you train your staff on health and safety matters. So when we do return, if we have got some guidance on what we should and shouldn't be doing, then it's how you go about communicating that to staff and how you're training staff. And they've really put in place a really good training program to make sure that all staff were aware of what they should and shouldn't be doing, but also giving a range of options to staff. And again, one of the things you'll need to think about is whether it's not a one size fits all for when people return. So you will have vulnerable members of staff who are still going to need to shield. You may have people, as I say, that are furloughed and others in the organisation that aren't furloughed. So it's about managing morale and managing that message. And you'll have pregnant employees. So it's just about, as I say, having a not one size fits all approach and being flexible and listening to your staff and giving options in terms of, rather than just simply telling them what to do. There's also going to be huge variations across sectors. So it's just about keeping an open mind. And finally, flexible working requests. One thing you definitely will need to keep an open mind on is flexible working when we come back. There are going to be new and different ways of working. As I said earlier, we've proven that we can work from home. and that businesses are now very much geared up to being able to work from home, and certainly at least as a temporary solution until we fully come out of this and we're all clear, then it certainly may be that you need to think about the ways and flexible ways of working as a temporary solution. You may already have a policy clearly on flexible working. Vulnerable and carers may need to work in a different way, and so you might, otherwise they might not be able to work at all. And so it's just thinking about those policies and whether they need to be reviewed and possibly even amended during this period leading up to return. Suggestions have been making flexible working requests open to everyone, not just those with 26-week service. Possibly making changes temporary. As I say, we don't know how long certain measures are going to be in place, so thinking about making temporary flexible working changes rather than the permanent changes that the normal statutory regime normally impose, and then introducing regular reviews, so just looking at the way in which things are working and seeing whether they're working well or not. Having a system in place to deal with the high demand is going to be important, because you might get a lot of requests all at the same time, and so you do need to think about having that system in place. Any requests will still need to be dealt with in a timely manner, because those of you familiar with the flexible working legislation, it is prescriptive in terms of time limits that it puts on you to deal with the requests and hold meetings and respond. So you do need to just think about whether you've got that system in place if you do get a high demand. And then finally, just bearing in mind that even if lockdown is eased, we may need to tighten restrictions again in the future, depending on what happens to the spread of the virus. So we can all do more now to make sure that we're ready for that, or have a system in place to make sure we can quickly go back to a flexible or a working from home or previous arrangements, should you need to. Moving on to the last section, again, as I said earlier, it's been a lot of the questions we had are around consultation. It's inevitable that businesses need to reorganise post-lockdown, and so James will just talk you through some of the issues that have come out of consultation, some of the questions that we've had.
Thanks, Rich. While I'm doing that, do you just want to look at the Q&As for me, and just we can pick up any questions if we have time?
Yeah,
as we go through.
I will. Yeah,
thank you.
I will.
So as you can see on the slide, a number of things to talk about. I get to cover some law, which is exciting for me. So the usual bits about how many redundancies, how that's going to work, timing, minimum periods, because there's a key point that's going to come up about cliff edges. So very briefly, and I know a lot of you on the call say, oh, I know all about this, James, but for those who don't, let's just remind ourselves what the point about collective and non-collective consultation is. So if I've got 20 or more proposed dismissals, so whether that's dismissal or re-engagement, going back to where Richard was talking about, where I'm seeking pay cuts and I'm perhaps going dismissal and re-engagement in the absence of consent, or straightforward redundancies, 20 or more at one establishment within a period of 90 days, that would trigger collective consultation. And if it's between 20 and 99, it would be a 30-day collective consultation period. And if it's 100 or more, it would be a 45-day collective consultation period. If it is 19 or less, then no collective consultation, and you're just into individual consultation. So some of you on the call will remember Woolworths. Richard, I'm sure you were a little boy that went in and didn't steal any of the sweets from the pick and mix, did you?
Of course not.
Of course not. Does that look like man like he's got an honest face? Wow. So those of you who do remember Woolworths, I mention it not just to get a rise out of Richard, but for the point about establishment. So I said the test is 20 or more at one establishment within a period of 90 days. So if you are a multi-site operation, it could be that each individual site will count as a separate establishment, as did each Woolworths store. And therefore, whether you are at collective consultation or not will depend upon how many exits, redundancies or dismissal and re-engagements you're looking at per establishment. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So that's timing. Just a separate piece on timing. Where we are in collective consultation, traditionally you put in place reps and then you go through the 30 or 45-day collective consultation. Sometimes that will be, in normal times, about a closure of a whole site, say, or mass redundancies. Here, we are in slightly odd times. You need to undertake that consultation potentially during furlough. And also, you need to think about how that's going to play out with the reps and their duties to the workforce. So some reps will be like, well, I don't want to be a turkey voting for Christmas. I don't want to sign off the employer's proposal early and enable the employer to undertake the individual consultation early on in the 30 or 45-day period. Some of them will go, no, we will continue discussing this for all or the majority of the 30 or 45-day period. The reason I say turkeys voting for Christmas, I'm sure you're ahead of me, is that the longer that they keep the collective consultation element going, the less able the employer is to move on to the individual consultation and therefore give notice earlier. As in an ideal world, you are perhaps looking at a situation where you start your collective consultation, you get the big issue, are we going to do this or not, out of the way, you get to individual consultation, you get to give notice, provided notice doesn't expire earlier than the 30 or 45-day period. You can do all that, but some reps might take you to the limit of 30 or 45 days, so you can compress depending on how it goes. That tells you all of what I've just talked about. Now, the key bit here is timing. So we're heading towards the 30th of June. Experience says, or perhaps I take heart from an article I read today that says we're not going to be facing a cliff edge. There will be a continuation in some shape or form of the furlough scheme. So whether that's in full at the 80% capped at 2.5K, whether that's a lower percentage, whether that's allowing employees to work and gain a much reduced subsidy, we don't know. Apparently, the Chancellor's going to make an announcement mid-May on this. Come back to mid-May as a key time in a moment. We will need to see, but hopefully there will not be a cliff edge. But we have to start thinking about that as being the furlough is going to come to an end. If we are in a 45-day collective consultation period, 30th of June, back 45 days, you'll be ahead of me, is middle of May. So if we are facing a situation where, holy kittens, we can't operate because we won't have the footfall, we won't have the income, it's not going to work for us beyond 30th of June, either you need to be looking at headcount reductions or you'll be looking at pay and hours cuts. So preparation is everything here. Just briefly, I've mentioned that it's going to be difficult conducting collective consultation while everyone's on furloughs. We know that employee reps can exercise their employee rep role on furlough. That got confirmed relatively recently. I absolutely endorse the creative communication. You need to be able to getting out to your furlough people and talking to them. There are two ways of conducting this. So the first is you go out to the workforce and say, we're back to our old friend consent. Would everybody please consent to the pay cut or to another way of doing it? And you may spend quite some time, particularly on the pay cut, seeking and gaining that consent, and only then assess if actually numbers for collective consultation are there and therefore collective consultation is triggered. Or you go more nuclear and you start collective consultation, bang, from the middle of May, say, if you're facing the 30th of June, because you can't waste time in seeking consent and then assessing. So there's some real tactical games you've got to play there to work out what is right for your workforce, right for your business in terms of income and risk. Now, we're getting increasingly questions about not just collective consultation, but individual consultation about redundancies. And we had one this morning. So I put my employees on furlough. The point of the furlough scheme originally was to safeguard jobs. It was widened than that and to help protect employers in the light of severe difficulties rising from the pandemic. Can I go through redundancy consultation during furlough? Yes, you can. Can I give notice during furlough? Yes, you can. You will probably have to top up from the 80% to the normal pay whilst they are working, in inverted commas, their notice period. That's our commercial view. There's nothing terribly clear in the guidance on that. but that's got to make sense. I think you might get some noise and some moral pressure on that from the employees to say, well, why are you making us redundant now? Why aren't you keeping us on furlough? Answer, we don't know what's going to happen, or we can predict what's going to happen when we come out of furlough. We won't need staffing levels as they are now. We've got no choice but to take changes and implement changes. Right, in the 2 minutes I've got left, obviously there are some risks with collective consultation. The usual one, if you get it wrong in terms of the process, and we all know about process and employment law, there's an unfair dismissal risk, but you should be able to reduce or remove that by going through due process. The protective award is the protective pay award, the penalty for failing to inform and consult. Do not get that wrong, because that is punitive, 13 weeks uncapped pay per employee, a quarter of a year's payroll for your affected employees. Don't do that. And there's a theoretical risk on discrimination if you select wrongly. Make sure you get your selection correct. That was a canter through, I think there's some very collective consultation, because I think there are some real issues about strategy here and being prepared to go back. Going back, if it's business as usual, is happy days and we don't need to think about this. If actually we're facing a very uncertain future and we need to trim costs or trim the headcount, you need to be getting prepared. And even if you get the preparation in now, so it's ready to go either from when the Chancellor speaks to us in the middle of May, or you are starting that, and in any event we have to extend when people leave, not the end of the world, but it's a good idea to take advantage of the furlough scheme to offset notice monies by using the furlough scheme when people are working their notice period. Okay, it's 14:58, so we're going to close. Any particular questions before we direct people to our hub, Rich?
No, there's a mix of questions, a lot of which you've covered off. Some are really quite detailed, so I think we will probably have to respond to people in writing. One, just looking for a very quick one that we might be able to answer quickly. One question, can consent to furlough be by email or does it have to be by signature? No, as long as you've got consent, and if an employee has returned, replied to an email giving consent, then that is perfectly valid consent. So there doesn't have to be an actual signature.
It would probably accept it.
Absolutely, I think I read one of the guidance notes I read said any type of communication whatsoever. So because I think the government are recognising that there is a complete broad spectrum of workers and employees here who operate in completely different industries and sectors, and it isn't easy communicating with everybody. And therefore, I think however you communicate with an employee and however an employee communicates their consent will be sufficient for these purposes, is our view.
Okay. So we'll pick up the rest of the questions later then, shall we? So you might want to take a look at our coronavirus hub, which has got lots of really good detailed information, practical guidance on there. We will share a copy of the slides. We will pick up any questions that we haven't had time to get to. Perhaps in hindsight, we had a bit too much content, so apologies if we haven't answered any of your questions. The technology has held up, hurrah, which we're very grateful for that. So from Richard and I would just like to say thank you very much for your time and attention today. Really appreciate it, and we will see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.